On today's episode of the Bourbon Bites podcast, I'm reviewing Barrell New Year 2022 and talking about the runners-up to my top 10 whiskeys of the year. Hello everyone and happy New Year's Eve. I'm actually recording this on the same day I'm putting it out, mainly because I wanted to get through my absolute favorite stream that I do every year, which was last night. I counted down my top 10 whiskeys of the year. That was over on YouTube, so if you missed it, you can check it out at youtube.com/bourbonbites. It was a fun list to make. There are some absolute hitters on it, but there are a few that, I did not include this year for various reasons, so I wanted to take a minute to talk about those that were left off this year and review Barrell's New Year 2022 bottle, because the brand sent me this and I knew I wanted to save it for a special occasion. So what better day than New Year's Eve to review this whiskey? So I actually have tried a little bit of this already, but I'm going to go ahead and pour some more so we can get into the review. So Barrell New Year is an annual release they put out each year. I had a sample of 2021 that I did on my New Year's Eve stream last year, which happened to fall on the same night as my normal stream, plus 2020 kind of deserved a stay-at-home kind of celebration. But the brand actually sent me a bottle this year, so big shout out to Barrell Craft Spirits who sent us for a review. Barrell has done some incredible stuff this year. Several of their products made my top 10 list, and some of their products are making my runners-up list as well, so they're doing some incredible stuff there. So this 2022 release is a blend of 5, 6, 7, 9, and 14-year-old straight bourbon whiskeys. Now, these were distilled all over the United States. They are from Tennessee, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Wyoming, New York, and Texas. So I don't know exactly the mash bills of each of those. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes going over them on this podcast, but just know that Barrell is incredible with their blending and they like to source from a lot of different places. So at least they're transparent, but dang, that's a lot of different places. This one comes in at 115.34 proof, which is cask strength, and of course it was aged in American white oak barrels. Now this is labeled as a bourbon whiskey, so we do know it's at least 50% corn. Not saying that all of those that were blended in were a bourbon, but it definitely ends up being a bourbon at the end result. So on the back of the bottle, they say, "New Year, new traditions. To toast the new year, we've crafted this limited release bourbon by marrying barrels of different ages and mash bills. We hope you will enjoy it with us." Well, that we will. Let's go ahead and give it a nose. That's really nice. Getting off of Christmas, so many Christmas dinners I went to while I was in South Carolina visiting my family and my husband's family. I had so many desserts that this on the nose is screaming a dessert, which, is a great note in a bourbon. It has a nice little toasted note and toasted oak as well. So it's a mix of like the marshmallow from the toasted aspect of it, but the oak is still dominant. It's not overly sweet, but it has some nice baked characteristics as well. Yeah, but lots of vanilla. Like it's like a vanilla frosting on top of some kind of baked good. It's a little fruity. I'm thinking like a wild berry kind of note. Not necessarily picking out certain berries, but there is some nice fruitiness that's kind of baked into the nose. Maybe a little bit of cherry. It's kind of like a bit of a sour aspect to that fruit, but it's balanced really nicely with the toasty oak that this is giving me. So before I take a sip of this, I do want to give a toast to the legend herself, Betty White, who passed away earlier this morning. I am so sad to hear of this, but I know she will live on as a Hollywood icon. She was a legend, and she'll live on in our hearts because, pretty much most of us grew up watching her in some capacity. So cheers to Betty White and her legacy. Oh man. So this is my first drink of the day. I did my stream last night, so jumping off the deep end with cask strength. So kind of caught me a little off guard, but it's 115.34 proof, so I appreciate that, but at, around noon, I don't know if I'm ready for that. So let me have another sip now that I know what to expect. Yeah, it's a really sharp wood up front. It's like it's a blend because it kind of reminds me of some of the younger, like wood shaving, sawdust kind of notes that I've gotten on some whiskeys, but there's like a pronounced richness and heftiness to it too. So it's nicely balanced. We know this is a blend of so many different whiskeys. I think what I'm getting is some of the younger whiskey, because the youngest whiskey in here is 5 years old. So I'm getting a little bit of that brightness, that bright, fresh wood from the 5-year-old, But that older 14 and 9-year-old that's in here too, I think I'm really getting the impact of that, because it's sharp in a way that it's dominant, but it's not unbalanced, dare I say. It's a weird balance between new oak and I always use this, but saturated oak, that really rich old oak like a rick house. So it's an interesting combination. It's weird that that's so upfront. Usually I get that more on the finish. So let's see what's behind that. Let's dive a little bit deeper. Yeah, right behind that oak, it brings out the sweetness, the vanilla that I was getting on the nose. I was thinking would express itself a little differently on the palate, but this is still vanilla, like vanilla ice cream up front. Then it gets like a little tart, and maybe that's what I was getting as cherry earlier on, but this time it's a little more like a lime tart. I'm trying really hard not to use their notes that they used on this, because I like to try to form my own before reading them. But I did see that there was a note of key lime pie, and that's actually what I'm getting the pie note from. It's like a lemon meringue more so, maybe. It has like that creaminess, that vanilla aspect, really, really sweet, toasted marshmallow. But there's like a little bit of tartness, and to me it was like a lime. So I see why they say key lime as a note. I think that's definitely, if you're looking for it, you can find that. The end of the palate to me is like super like coffee espresso, like you just finished a cup of coffee and it's kind of lingering on your palate. I'm getting a lot of that on the back end of the finish, but it's not as rich, I guess, as I would say espresso. To me, it's like lighter, maybe even like some sort of like a black tea kind of finish, or like a chai tea. It's got the creaminess, the milkiness of like a or like a Thai iced tea or something like that. I know I'm talking over the place, but I think this has a really unique kind of tea leaf note that I don't usually get on the finish. Well-rounded. I mean, dang, this is a pretty freaking good expression. Now, I don't have the 2021 to compare to, so I'm not entirely sure, which one's better. But for around $100, I think this is a very deserving bourbon to be sold at that price. Barrell is, known as a premium brand, so you would expect the higher price, but I don't think they took any shortcuts. I mean, there are some younger whiskeys in here, the 5, 6, 7-year-old, but I don't think that it's, it doesn't taste young. I think those are more of balance. Normally with like an older 9 to 14-year-old bourbon, sometimes it gets a little too oaky, a little too tannic. I think the 5, 6, and 7-year-old really balance that out. Now, I'm not sure, where they're sourcing from. I mean, Ohio, Wyoming, New York, there's a lot of distilleries that whiskey could be coming from, so I definitely don't think you can break this down and be like, oh, I can taste the, Tennessee note. I can taste the Indiana whiskey. I just think it's a really solid, balanced bourbon. And, it's not distinctive enough to tell me like where I think the dominant whiskey is from, but that doesn't mean it's bad. And I think for $100, this is a winner. So cheers to the new year, and thank you, Barrell, again for letting me try this. This is a great way to ring in the last day of 2021, since it's already kind of been dulled by Betty White's passing. But, this is a great whiskey to drink in her memory. So cheers again, Betty. Thank you for being a friend. So this episode is still going to be a little shorter than normal. I'm still kind of recovering from the holidays. I just got back in town 2 nights ago, so it's been really busy. So I promise that these are going to go back to their regular length, the regular format next week. But this one, I want to take some time to really dive into the runners-up to my best of 2021 list. I noticed there were a lot of interesting reactions to my top 10 over on YouTube. Like I said, if y'all missed that stream, you can watch the replay now. I think the biggest thing is a lot of my items on my list were very much everyday bourbons and everyday whiskeys in general. There were very few limited edition releases, and I made that decision this year because I found myself not really hunting for the hard to find bottles as much this year, and I don't know particularly why. I didn't tell myself not to do that. To me, I was more impressed by the new releases that were in the less than $100 price range. I had very limited access to some of the LEs this year. I didn't get sent, I'm not on a lot of distribution lists, so I didn't get to try a lot of them. But some of them I did get to try, and as much as I wanted to include them on the list, I knew that I couldn't recommend them in a way knowing that no one could get their hands on them. That's kind of why I made that decision this year. Sometimes people include some, Buffalo Trace Antique Collection bottles in their best of list. Sometimes there's some limited, extremely limited release whiskeys. But the only one that was really super limited on my list, which, spoiler alert if you haven't listened to it, is Ardbeg Scorch, which is the committee release of that. So that was very, very limited. But everything else, Blue Spot was also limited. But most other things on that list were things that you could find in the stores. At least at some point this year, you would have been able to find them. But I did want to take a moment to go through some of the whiskeys that I would have absolutely included on the list if I didn't, restrict myself to things that I was able to pick up myself. And I think the biggest one, the one that I wanted to talk about the most, because it kind of feels unfair. I basically had this whiskey in my top 3, and it wasn't until last minute that I realized, I can't fairly recommend that, because I've gotten a sample from the distillery that they sent me to review, but they just sent it a few weeks ago. I mean, I think someone said they saw it on the shelves, but nowhere near me has this bottle been available, and that is Larceny Barrel Proof C921. This is the last batch of the year. It usually comes out in September, but this year it came out super, super late. I'm talking end of November, early December. And I know there were, lots of delays, and totally understandable why it was delayed, but this batch of Larceny just absolutely blew me away. I was so impressed by it. I still haven't, done a blind flight of all the batches of Larceny. I do hope to do that early next year, but this C921 is an absolutely incredible. It makes me excited for Larceny Barrel Proof again, because for the longest time, a lot of those were just kind of falling flat. And I think not just for me, but for other, I've talked to Perry from This My Bourbon podcast. He kind of agreed with the other batches. They just were kind of lackluster, but this one really impressed me. So I want to, shout it from the rooftops. Like, if you see this bottle, pick it up. It's great. But to include it on my best of 2021 list felt a little unfair, because I have not seen it. I don't think I'll be seeing it anytime, remotely soon. But I do know, for those of you that are listening to this podcast, please know that that's an absolutely incredible bourbon. And if you see it, pick it up, because it's definitely the best Larceny Barrel Proof I've ever tried. Speaking of ones that I couldn't get my hands on, I was actually blinded with a sample of Russell's Reserve 13. I actually unknowingly tasted that and gave my thoughts on a Twitch stream, which, there were not very many people watching it, but that ended up being Russell's Reserve 13, and I just absolutely loved it. I saved the rest of that sample because I wanted to get into it on either a video or a stream or something like that, because it was so good. But again, I searched for that bottle. I tried my hardest to find that bottle in 2021, but could not find it. So I would have included that on my list absolutely if I were to get my hands on it, but it was kind of elusive to me. Same way with the Jaxk Daniel's 10 year. I mean, I just reviewed a sample on this podcast last episode, and it was absolutely incredible. I wasn't expecting it to be so good. It would have earned a spot on my best of 2021 list for sure, but again, just had a sample of it. I did not have a chance to buy a bottle of it. So both of those were absolute winners. I mean, they would have absolutely made my list if I didn't have that caveat of being able to purchase the bottles. Another one that's kind of like, people are like, why you tried this year? Why isn't it on your list? That is Barrell's Gold Label, the $500 bottle of Barrell bourbon. I did a YouTube video on it reviewing it, saying, is $500 bourbon worth it? Absolutely, if you have the money, and it's not gonna, it's not gonna make you think twice about it. But people like me, I'm not gonna go buy a $500 bottle of bourbon on a whim. So while it was probably one of the best things I've ever tasted, probably the best, it's the most expensive bourbon and probably one of the best bourbons I've tried, I didn't feel like I could, put it on this list and be fair to the other things that I would actually buy. So that's the reason that one wasn't on the list. But there were some other ones that I really enjoyed this year that were true runners-up and that would have been on the list if it was like a top 20. But it was a top 10, so I had to limit myself. So some of these, I actually have one here to drink today, and that is Doc Swinson's Alter Ego Rye. So this is a bottle that I've actually picked up multiples of, and that's because I enjoy it so much, and I really, really wanted to include this one on the list. If you're unaware, it is a rye whiskey. It's an Indiana rye whiskey, but it's been finished in rum casks. So it has some nice sweetness. It's 95 proof. I don't think it's as sweet as like Angel's Envy rye, because I think to me that was a little too sweet. This one that I think is absolutely, that finish impacts it so nicely. And it was really a toss-up between this and Stellum rye. Both of them are mostly Indiana ryes. And this one did have the unique aspect of the finish. However, when side-by-siding them, I think the Stellum was a better blend. It had such a rich mouthfeel that I had to put it in my list and leave this one off, unfortunately. But since this would have been my number 11 if I were to extend the list, I'm going to go ahead and pour a little bit of it and just drink along while I finish off the rest of these runners-up for you guys. So this isn't age stated. They do say it's been aged for up to 6 years. I imagine it's probably a good bit younger than that, being Indiana rye, and the price point. I mean, it was actually, I think it was like $50 when I first got it, but it went on clearance at my local liquor store, and I picked up a second bottle for $28. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so cheap. Y'all know I like different, and to me, this one is very different. It's got the brighter notes from the rye, but it has that sweetness that I think is coming from the rum. And I think it's just super balanced. I mean, I know this one kind of got mixed receptions from other people, but for me, for a $40 to $50-ish rye whiskey, I think this kind of beats a lot of the other younger MGP ryes. I mean, there's a few out there. There's, Dickel rye, which is my first entry into rye, really. But there's, Knob Creek rye. I think Knob Creek's a little bit older and a lot more, bourbon-esque in its flavor palette. But this one definitely drinks like a rye, but I think that sweetness from the rum really rounds it out and makes it a, worthy number 11 if I were to make the list even longer. Speaking of, MGP, another one that I've been raving about this year, y'all have heard me mention on the podcast a couple times, that's Old Scout's Port Finished Rye. I just have a thing for finished MGP ryes. I don't know, maybe I'm weird, but I think it being younger and being, brighter, it latches onto these darker finishings, or even like, sweeter with the rum. I think it latches onto it and it meshes so well with it. So that was one that also, I've shouted it out several times on my podcast and on my streams. It would have definitely been in my top, 15, 20, whatever, if I would have made that list even longer. Although we ran overtime last night, so definitely didn't want to make it any longer. But that was another, highlight of my year. And lastly, this is one that came up on our after party hangout last night, which if you don't know, that's what I do for all of my patrons that are $10 and up. We do an after party after every Thursday night live stream where we hang, we talk about the stream, we talk about other things as well. And one came up that my friend Swan and Donnie the Linux Cat were talking about, and that was Laphroiag Cairdeas, the 2021 release. That one absolutely was a highlight of the year. It's the one that was the PX cask finish. I did a flight of it and the Compass Box 3 and then the Johnny Walker High Rye. And there's also, did we have another Laphroiag on there? I don't remember. But the Cairdeas was, to me, one of the best scotches I've tried this year. And if that list were, any longer, I would absolutely have included it. It's a standout Laphroiag. It's probably one of the best Laphroigs I've ever had. But I didn't want to overwhelm the list with a lot of scotches, because I know a lot of you guys here are only here for the American whiskey, which is fair. But y'all know I experiment with other types of whiskey, Scotch, Irish, Canadian. So I hope you understand, why I included mostly bourbons, but there's a lot of variety on my list. I'm happy about that. I'm glad I didn't limit myself to just the best bourbons of the year. But I made sure to hit pretty much every category. I didn't name a Canadian, so if I were to pick a best Canadian I tried this year, it would probably have to be that 23-year-old cask strength JP Wisers. I had the 35-year-old, which is even older, but it's 100 proof, I believe. But those were a toss-up. I remember doing it on the stream thinking I liked the cask strength version better, but going back and forth between the 23 and 35, both were incredible whiskeys. So yeah, if I had to pick a best Canadian whiskey, it would be either of those two. JP Wisers, especially at higher proof, is really, really great. And thank you, Donald Rance, for the recommendation on those. But I think that about does it for my runners up. I hope this gives you a little bit more insight into why I picked the ones that I did and why I left certain ones off. Not that they weren't worthy. I just wasn't able to get more than just a sample of some of them. And some of these, were really, really good. But I think there were items on the list that were just a little bit better. So let me know what you guys think. If you had a top whiskey of the year, please let me know on Discord or send me an email. Would love to know what you guys picked up this year, what's your favorite, and what you hope to hold on to and share in the next year. And thank y'all for tuning in, whether you're listening to this on New Year's Eve or you're listening to it in 2022, the future. Hopefully you had a fantastic New Year's weekend. I know I'm keeping it pretty low key. I did a lot of celebrating over Christmas, so this year I'm just gonna be chilling at home, maybe pop into a few other streams tonight depending on who's going live. So thank y'all for listening. Until next time, this is Bourbon Bites. Cheers, and I will talk to you next year.